You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Ajay Shukla, a retired Indian Army colonel and journalist for the Business Standard, who's joining me all the way from India today. Ajay, how are you doing?
Very well, Ankit. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. Thanks for asking. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. For listeners, just a little bit of background on Ajay, who I've been reading for several years, but this is actually his first appearance on the Asia Geopolitics podcast. Ajay does some of the best writing out of India on Indian defense policy and Indian security policy. And of late, of course, some of our listeners who've been listening to the podcast for more than a year are, of course, going to be aware that India and China have been mired in the most serious standoff at their disputed border in eastern Ladakh and elsewhere for now almost a year. And of course, these disputes range back much further. Last June, of course, there was a terrible skirmish in which 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives and an untold number of Chinese casualties also. But Ajay's been doing consistently some of the best reporting from this region. And actually, the reason that I'm delighted to have Ajay on the show today and what we'll be talking about on this episode is his recent report for the Business Standard titled The Indian Army's Pivot to the North, in which he reports the blockbuster development, which is the Indian Army's reorientation of the One Corps as a mountain strike corps for Ladakh. Ajay, that's enough for me, and I'd actually love for you to sort of take the opportunity to explain, first of all, what exactly does this mean, the Indian Army's decision to take the One Corps and convert it into a new mountain strike corps? Can you just place the significance of this decision in context for many of our listeners who may not be fully aware of the Indian Army's general layout, so to speak?
Yeah, Ankit, thanks for that very generous introduction. Viewers who listen to this podcast would know that India faces a two-front threat and prepares for a two-front threat. The Western threat, which, as it's called, from Pakistan, and the Northern threat, as it's called, from China. Now, India has perhaps somewhat aspirationally always said that its main threat comes from China and that Pakistan is a subsidiary threat. In fact, its deployment patterns and the way that it has deployed its military and tasked its military tells a different story. The Indian Army has about 38 infantry divisions, and out of those, some 25 are oriented towards Pakistan, and just about 12 or so are oriented towards China, with one division as the Central Army Headquarters Reserve. Now that shows, that deployment pattern where you have almost twice as many forces deployed towards Pakistan as you have against China, shows that your main threat, in fact, is perceived to be from Pakistan. But that is apparently now changing, and the first tangible evidence of that reorientation is this transfer of One Corps. That's one of the three mechanized Indian strike corps, all three of which are oriented towards Pakistan. One Corps is now being reoriented towards China, towards facing the China threat from the north, as a strike reserve, ready to deal with any contingencies that might happen. For example, the contingency that took place last year when Chinese troops crossed the line of actual control and occupied chunks of Indian territory. So that would mean that essentially three Indian divisions are being taken away from the Pakistani frontier and reoriented towards the Chinese frontier. That has huge implications. First of all, in terms of the signaling that that India is doing towards China, we are no longer content to just talk about you being a threat. We are now fundamentally reorienting our military towards the Chinese border. And secondly, the strategic signaling, beg your pardon, that is being taken place, that it is carrying out vis-a-vis Pakistan, which is a sort of a lessening of tensions, a lessening of forces towards the Pakistani frontier, which then sort of cuts into the Pakistani narrative that the Indian Army is essentially an anti-Pakistan army. So essentially, from 25 divisions facing Pakistan, we are now down to just 22. The three divisions of the One Corps now being taken away from the Pakistan frontier, and the Chinese divisions, which were just about 12 divisions, now going up to about 15. Mm-hmm. So that's a big signal from the Indian side.
And so, in practical terms, what sort of assets are we talking here, just in terms of numbers and capabilities, in terms of actually making a difference? I mean, a mountain warfare is, of course, very specialized. It's not something that you can take sort of a unit that's or a division that's been oriented to operate in the plains and just convert them into a strike corps. So, in practical terms, what kind of assets and capabilities are we talking about here?
You're talking about a mountain division, which consists of essentially about 18,000 troops. And it is more lightly equipped than a conventional division or the plains infantry divisions that the Indian Army maintains in the plain sector, the non-mountainous sector. So you're looking at about 9 to 12 battalions in a division, each battalion consisting of about 800 soldiers, more lightly equipped, less heavy weaponry, and more suited for quick movement from defensive positions in the mountains to other positions. Lighter artillery. Some of the new artillery that the Indian military has been buying, the ultralight howitzers from BAE Systems, are specifically designated towards the mountain divisions. So you have, firstly, a difference in equipping and numbers, and secondly, a difference in training and acclimatization. We are talking about mountainous heights ranging from 15,000 to 18,000 feet here. That's very difficult terrain for operating in because of the shortage of oxygen. So these mountain divisions are trained to operate in those altitudes. They are acclimatized for operating in those altitudes. And when you're talking about two new mountain divisions being reoriented towards the Chinese front, you're talking about two divisions of 18,000 troops each, adding up to about 36,000 troops, which is a significant force level. Of course, these being strike reserves will not be deployed into forward defensive positions along the mountains. They will be held back in reserve, ready to counter any intrusions by China with intrusions of its own in selected areas where it might have sort of perceived a Chinese vulnerability. So that's the difference that is going to take place, and that is the reorientation that will take place with one corps. I should add here that one corps has three divisions, not two. Two of them are infantry divisions, which will be reoriented towards the Chinese threat. And the third division is a armored division, which will now go into the Central Strike Reserve, which will operate under Army headquarters.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, it's not just acclimation to higher altitudes that takes a while, but in practical terms, reorganization will not happen overnight. So, how long will this take exactly? And then, we've been mostly in a descriptive mode so far on this episode, but I wanted to sort of ask you for your take. I mean, is this in your opinion? I mean, too little, too late? I mean, we're seeing this happen into the worst crisis between India and China in several decades, of course. I mean, what would have been the difference if this had been done a year or two earlier, for instance?
Well, in fact, the reorientation has been taking place over the last 15 years. Around 2007, 2008, India raised two new mountain divisions for the Chinese frontier. They were deployed in the eastern sector of Arunachal Pradesh. And then, around about 2012, India raised for the first time a mountain strike corps. Earlier, it had those three mechanized strike corps for the plain sector against Pakistan that I spoke about earlier. Around 2012, they raised a mountain strike corps with two infantry divisions, mountain divisions, both of them, to counter any Chinese intrusions. But those were spread out. One of them in the western sector of Ladakh, one of them deployed in the region of the eastern sector facing Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim. So it was not functional as a cohesive mountain strike corps. They were actually just two spread out infantry divisions, which have sort of a lesser ability to generate force and momentum, operational momentum in the mountains, which is very difficult. Now, with the raising of this strike corps, you will have one mountain strike corps in the eastern sector, one mountain strike corps in the western sector. So my assessment is that the operational momentum that can be generated by two mountain strike corps, each of them equipped with two infantry divisions, in two different sectors, gives significantly a larger number of options to the Indian military. It sort of allows the Indian military to sort of strike in two different sectors, which then creates decision problems for the Chinese side. But coming to your question about how long it's going to take, this is going to take, in my opinion, at least two training seasons, which means we're talking about 2 years here. There will have to be a fundamental reorientation, not just of operational tasks, but of thinking, because a plains infantry division or an infantry strike corps is a very different animal from a mountain strike corps. And that will take some time to actually realize on the ground. So, summing up what I was saying, it's going to be at least 2 years before this actually comes into operational effect.
Mm-hmm. And so, you talked a little bit about the India's two-front challenge and the need to sort of apportion limited resources between Pakistan and China. So my question here is how. So you've talked a little bit about how this affects the conventional military balance with Pakistan, but do you personally see risks in this reorganization in terms of taking some capabilities away from the Pakistani front and putting them towards Eastern Ladakh, where certainly things have been hotter in the past 10 months or so, but of course things can change once again, and how might the Indian Army respond in the case that the border with Pakistan once again does heat up?
Yes, that's a very good point, Ankit. Because India's sort of posture against Pakistan has always been based on punitive deterrence, the ability to strike into Pakistan, operationalizing the cold start doctrine that many of you have talked about. The ability to enter into Pakistan along narrow thrust lines with a large momentum of force, to impose punitive damages for any sort of a misadventure that Pakistan might enter into. And for that, India has planned on having three strike corps, which would be able to counter and sort of overmatch the two Pakistani armored divisions that would be ranged against it. So now, instead of a 3 versus 2 scenario against Pakistan, India will only be able to muster up a 2 versus 2 scenario. And that will sort of reduce the ability of India to sort of impose punitive damages. It will have to rethink its strategy towards Pakistan. This is very good news for Pakistan, I can tell you, because its defensive conundrum and its threat matrix significantly reduces. It becomes more oriented towards China on the Indian side, but the sort of risks that you talked about, the sort of reduction in capabilities that you mentioned, are definitely there on the Pakistani frontier, and that is going to complicate India's security calculations.
I'm enjoying the sounds in the background with you, with the rooster crowing the wake up call. It I think matches quite nicely with this wake up call for India that we've seen in Eastern Ladakh in many ways. Anyways, I wanted to ask you one last question before we wrap this discussion up, which is really, on the overall situation at the border. I've done a few podcast episodes on this as the Eastern Ladakh situation has waxed and waned, so to speak. Of course, it very much remains running. We're taping this podcast. It is Tuesday morning, January 26th, where Ajay is. It's Monday, January 25th, where I am in the United States. But on January 24th, Sunday, we had the 9th Corps Commander level talks between the Indian Army and the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Like the 8 previous talks, resulted in very little material progress. The two sides remain mired in a standoff amid the bitter winter in Eastern Ladakh. So, Jay, my final question is really about your sense of where this is all going. This is already into a very different realm than even the Doklam crisis in 2017, which at the time appeared to be more serious than its antecedents. So, what can we expect? And in your terms, in your view, what can the Indian government really do to manage the current standoff along the border?
Well, as you mentioned, Ankit, this is a standoff. It's not easing as a consequence of the talks. You mentioned the ninth round of talks that took place on Sunday. They yielded very little. The Chinese are talking about de-induction in certain sectors where it suits them, but the sectors where they wanted to make gains and they wanted to put pressure on India, and I speak specifically of the Depsang sector and the Doklam sector. No, I beg your pardon, not the Doklam sector, the Pangong Lake sector. In these two sectors, China is not going to give up. It has given no signals so far that it is ready to yield or withdraw or sort of give up any of the gains that it has made on the Indian side of the line of actual control. So essentially, the troops are deployed there in a face-to-face confrontation. China has the first movers advantage, having taken India by surprise last April when it moved into Indian territory, and it's not giving up its gains. So you're essentially looking at tying up two infantry divisions and a roughly equal number of Chinese divisions into a sort of a confrontation situation on the border. No signs of withdrawal. The Indian government has tried both military level talks and diplomatic dialogue between New Delhi and Beijing. But China seems to be set on retaining its gains. So essentially, this means that a significant proportion of Indian troops, which were earlier held in reserve, the Northern Command Reserve and the Army Headquarters Reserve, are now tied up on the ground. And that is one of the reasons why they're trying to generate more reserves by reallocating one corps to the. But for now, it seems like India, which was in a face-to-face confrontation for all these years since 1948 with Pakistan on the line of control, is now actually facing the situation where it's into a face-to-face confrontation with China on the line of actual control, as the Sino-Indian border is called, and that's not good news for the Indian military.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ajay, I'm sure we'll both have other occasions to revisit this topic since, as you just said, it doesn't look like this will be evaporating anytime soon. But I really do want to thank you for joining me today and cramming what is frankly a tremendous amount of insight into less than 20 minutes. I really appreciate it. So thanks so much for joining me on the Asia Geopolitics podcast today.
Thanks, Ankit. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.